Hi everyone, and welcome to our web video on Chapter 3 about external analysis. So we've gotten to the point in the course where we're going to start analyzing how a firm competes and what forces place pressure on it in its competitive environment. So in order to do that, we look at two different external environmental sectors in what I call the donut, because there's an outside circle and an inside circle. So the first portion of the donut is this outside circle, the idea of the macro environment. And the macro environment gets divided up into 6 different sectors: the political, the economic, social, technical, environmental, and legal areas of the macro environment. And those are sort of big, broad ways to describe the macro environment. There's a lot of overlap in between them, which you'll see because the diagram's not segmented up. Sometimes the forces that are acting as a political macro environmental force on your industry will act as a legal macro environmental force on a different industry, which is a really good point about macro environmental trends, which is to say that they act at the population level. So in other words, they are placing pressure on absolutely everyone, all individuals, but definitely all organizations, and much more importantly, because when we look at this external environmental analysis, we are only looking at the industry level. They act on all industries. So in other words, no matter what kind of force or trend you see happening in the macro environment, it's affecting every possible industry. Sometimes that effect is different. So it affects one industry positively while it affects another industry negatively. And sometimes the effect is not so much that an industry will do anything to act upon it. But these trends that happen in the macro environment are such that they act on every possible industry. So try to keep that factor about the macro environment in mind. The other idea that you want to keep in mind is that the macro environment is made up of only trends. And these trends, they change slowly over time. And when you look at the sectors that make up the external environment, they're things like socio-cultural trends. So they're attitudes that take a very long time to shift. And that's really important because industries' opportunity and threats will come out of the macro environment. And so when you're identifying opportunities and threats, what you're really looking at is the projection of that trend over time. And in order to know that, you need to be looking at a trend as it's changed before and making a guess about which direction it will go in. So that means that you're not analyzing single events, which isn't to say that single events can't provide opportunities and threats for an organization or an industry. The problem is that a single event will create a short-lived opportunity or threat for an organization. And when we talk about the macro environment, we're talking about opportunities and threats that it's affecting everyone all the time. You're talking about trends that take a long time to change. So here you have a macro environmental trend in terms of the number of pets who are owned by people in America. And you can see that this trend has taken a long time to shift. It's been slowly rising, and you'll note that this chart projects out into the future by 5 years, which is what all of your library database charts coming out of IBISWorld or MarketLine will do for you, is project that 5 years into the future. And that's the trend line that's really making a difference for organizations that operate in the industries that are positively or negatively affected by this particular line. So when you think about something like that, when you're looking for industries that are positively affected by the number of pets, you're probably talking about a lot of the industries that are connected to animals or caretaking for animals. So in fact, you'll actually see that this line reflects the growth of PetSmart and Banfield veterinary clinics and other industries related to the caretaking of animals. It also reflects the growth in the number of schools or universities that offer veterinary programs, so DVMs, Doctorate of Veterinary Medicine. It's risen in concordance with this line, which makes a lot of sense because as we in the U.S. own more pets, we also need more care for them. So you'll see that industries will respond to this opportunity presented to them. But it's also a threat. And threats can be a little harder to come up with, a little harder to think of, and they require you often to be creative. So what I'll offer to you is that this line represents probably a pretty large threat to most industries that are invested in any kind of birth rate in America. Because as the number of pets rises, often the number of children in a family will lower, especially because the idea of what it means to have a cat or a dog has changed in America substantially, even in the last 10 years. And so I would guarantee that there are hospitals that are looking at this line and thinking to themselves that this means that the number of babies born in their maternity units is going down. So possibly some of the actions that they're going to take is that they'll slow down the hiring of obstetricians, or they will highlight some of the offerings that they have that are diversified into other areas. So you can see then that the opportunities and the threats, they dictate actions that organizations inside certain industries take, because they are affecting all industries at different rates and different levels. So just to do a little bit of a review, the macro environmental commandments are that trends happen at the population level. So when you're analyzing your company, there's a tendency to think of the macro environment as being a reflection of your organization, that your organization responds to the macro environment. But that's not entirely true. The industry in which your organization is embedded will respond to the macro environmental trends around it, because they happen at the industry level. That means that your organization will likely be considering the way its rivals will react to certain trends, and trying to anticipate those changes will influence the actions that they take. But trends are affecting their entire industry and everyone in it. You also want to remember that macro environmental trends go up or down over time. So when you're identifying opportunities and threats in a SWOT analysis, what you want to consider is that some level is rising or some level is falling, and the organization will be responding to that rise or that decrease. But never will they be responding to something that is stagnant or stable in time. They are responding to the fact that the amount of something is rising or going down. Likewise, macro-environmental trends aren't single events, which isn't to say that an organization can't respond to a single event. They absolutely can. However, single events dissipate over time much more quickly than macro-environmental trends. So when organizations move to capitalize on an opportunity or defend against a threat that was a single event, they will do so in the short term, as opposed to when they move to capitalize on an opportunity or defend against a threat that is in macro environment in their pestle factors. So if we take a look again at this donut, we're going to move our way into the competitive environment. And one of the things that you want to remember is that this external environmental sector, this model that we're looking at here, your company, your single corporation, is like the dot over one of the I's in the rivalry amongst existing competitors, because your organization is nested inside those existing competitors. But that means that all of the other levels of this macro environment or its competitive environment are happening around the organization. So we aren't looking at the inside of an organization yet at all. We're almost entirely only looking at industry level trends. Although as we move into the competitive environment, we're also starting to look at the industries that surround your focal industry. And so you can see inside this diagram here that what we're really going to start looking at is the 5 forces. And of course, the 5 forces are made up of the bargaining power of suppliers and buyers, the threats from new entrants and substitute products, and also the rivalry that exists among the competitors in your industry. The primary question that you want to ask yourself when you do a 5 forces analysis is whether or not the industry is attractive. And what that question means is, can I make a profit in this industry? It does not mean, what would it cost me to get into this industry? And often that's a mistake that people will make when they want to think to themselves, can I jump into this entrepreneurially? Can I get my way into this industry cheaply? And if you can get your way into an industry on $27 and a shoestring, then chances are everybody else can too. And that means that the industry is not at all attractive. It's the opposite of attractive. So if you want to think to yourself that when you do a 5 forces analysis, the question that you are asking is, can I make a profit in this industry? Try to pretend that you're Tim Cook, that you're the CEO of Apple, who has one of the largest available cash hoards that we've ever seen in modern American business. So he has the ability to jump into just about into any industry that he wants to. So the question that he would ask himself is there the possibility that he would make money inside that industry? He's not asking himself if he could get into it easily, because he doesn't want to get into an industry he can get into easily. When we talk about rivalry, one of the questions we're asking ourselves is how different the main products are and how high the costs are for buyers to switch. And so when you want to think about that, what you're talking about for switching costs is a question of what it financially costs a buyer to move to a different product, but also what it emotionally or intelligently costs a buyer to switch. And so a good example of this is Apple. Apple, when they first came out with the big bubble TV that had the bright colors built into the monitor and no tower, they had a mouse that only had one button. And for many people in America who had been trained on Microsoft-based computers, the idea of having one button on the mouse was incredibly confusing. And that caused a lot of people to avoid switching for many, many years. The other major question you want to ask yourself is how different the main products are. Because if the products are hugely different, then the amount of rivalry is not going to be as much. But if you're thinking about somebody like Target and Walmart, they offer the exact same product lines, really. I mean, there are a few differences, but for the most part, they offer the same diversity of products and often the same exact products. And so that causes them to compete much more heavily, which you can see here in the lines that I'm offering. When things are much more different, the amount of rivalry goes down. When the costs for buyers to switch are high, then the amount of rivalry will go down. All right? For right now, go ahead and ignore the idea of the life cycle, although if you're interested in learning more about that, your book has a very good definition of it. So let's take a look then at the threat of substitute products or services. One of the things you really want to remember when you do a 5 forces analysis is that substitutes are not competitors. They aren't competitors, substitutes aren't competitors, substitutes aren't competitors, substitutes aren't competitors. I will say it as many times as you need for me to hear it. But one of the things that you have to remember is that competitors exist inside the circle here in the middle. They exist as little dots on top of the I over rivalry or existing or competitors. That's where your focal industry goes. And so when you're talking about competitors, you have to nest them inside that circle. If you don't, then you shift the entire industry analysis that you do in 5 forces. And this becomes really important when you're starting to think about who the buyers and who the suppliers are in an industry. Because when you change the industry that goes inside the circle, when you shift it by accident, you'll get your analysis of the power of buyers or suppliers wrong. So one of the questions that you want to ask yourselves about substitute products is whether or not they're available and attractively priced. Because if you have a substitute that is available and attractive, because it's cheaper than the product that the competitors inside the circle make, then you probably have a problem. So one of the ways that you can think about this is if you're analyzing the soda industry inside the circle, you're looking at Coke and Pepsi and Dr. Pepper inside that circle, one of the threats of substitute products is tap water. And tap water is widely available and attractively priced. And so that's going to create a threat of substitute products. Additionally, if it has better features, which you might argue that tap water does not, then it is going to raise the threat of substitute products. And additionally, if your buyers can move into your substitute products quickly and easily and cheaply, then you have a high threat of substitute products. That makes for an unattractive industry. So you can see that the arrows here represent that idea. When we talk about the threat of new entrants, one of the biggest questions we're asking ourselves is how high are the barriers to entry? And you want really, really high barriers to entry because the higher the barriers are, the less likely it is that other people are going to jump into your industry and take business away from you. So you want really high barrier to entry to drive down your threat of new entrants, because if your barriers to entry are really low, if anybody can jump into your industry with just a business license that they can get for $200, then chances are you're interacting in a fairly unattractive industry, and your threat of new entrants is going to be pretty high, and that's a problem. The same thing goes for how big the pool of possible entrants is. For some industries, when you think about somebody like airline manufacturing inside that rivalry among the existing competitors, you really only get Boeing and Airbus. And the threat of new entrants is relatively low. The pool of possible entrants who can afford the space and the contracts and the materials that it takes to build a plane are pretty low. So their threat of new entrants is relatively low. They're able to monitor that pretty closely. However, if the amount of buyer demand spikes suddenly in an industry, that will also drive up the threat of new entrants. And so you want to watch out for that. When we take a look at the horizontal line in a five forces analysis, I cannot stress this enough. What you want to do is make sure that you place the proper industry inside the circle. You really want to know who it is that you're looking at for this rivalry among existing competitors. And one of the things you probably want to do, particularly if you're starting to do an external analysis of your firm for your deliverables, one of the things you want to do is look at who's nested in as those existing competitors and write them in directly. If you just draw this five forces analysis out and you nest your firm and its competitors inside that circle, then analyzing who the suppliers are and who the buyers are becomes a lot easier. However, when it comes to determining the powers of forces, supplier power and buyer power are backwards from each other, which makes a lot of sense. So one of the questions that you're going to ask yourselves in each area is whether or not products are differentiated. And so when you think about it, if products are highly standard, then your buyers have the possibility to negotiate easily. They can easily switch over to some other firm. So think about Target and Walmart again. When it comes to analyzing where you're going to go, chances are the question you ask yourself is not whether or not you can get paper towels at Target or Walmart, unless you have a very specific kind of paper towel that you want and one of them doesn't carry it. But likely the way that you determine which store you go to, which is your negotiating power, the way you determine which one you go to is probably location. It's which one is on the way home from work for me. But the more standard the products are, the more power your buyers have, the less attractive your industry is. Same thing for switching costs. If your switching costs are low, your buyers have a lot of power. That becomes unattractive in an industry. You don't want your buyers to have negotiating power. And if you only have a few buyers, so if you're an industry who sells to very large conglomerates and only a few of them, so if you think about car manufacturing, they sell to a fairly unionized network of dealers, and those dealers have a lot of negotiating power because they buy in large quantities. And so because they're large and few in number, that industry has a relatively high bargaining power of buyers, which is unattractive. So with supplier power, this is going to work in the opposite direction. If the products are differentiated, so if there is the need for a supplier to carry a lot of different products, or if they can specialize in the one and only product that you can find from them. So if you're in the restaurant industry and you absolutely require a blue-footed chicken, because that's the way your dish works, then your suppliers have a fair amount of bargaining power because there aren't that many who provide it, which is the next question. But also the product is pretty differentiated between what you can get from Tyson and what you can get from the manufacturers of a blue-footed chicken. So your supplier power goes up when there are fewer suppliers who are very large and when products are highly differentiated. If, however, the suppliers are completely dependent on the focal industry for all of their revenue, then that's going to drive your supplier power down. And that's really important to think about as well, is that you want to keep your supplier power low. So, in summary, the question that you want to ask yourself with a competitive environment or a five forces analysis is whether or not the industry is attractive, which means can I make money in it? And one of the ways for you to figure that out are with these questions. Your book also includes a lot of really good questions that you can ask yourselves. One of the things I will highly encourage you to do is draw the five forces analysis out to make sure that you get the right competitors inside the circle, because otherwise you'll shift the industries that go in the supplier boxes and the buyer boxes, and you have the potential to analyze the threat represented by them or the bargaining power incorrectly. And if you get that high, low value wrong, your ability to analyze whether or not the industry is attractive is also going to be a little shifted. So, in conclusion, your macro environment, the area in which your firm interacts, is made up entirely of the pestle level forces in its macro environment and the industries that touch it directly inside its 5 forces level analysis. But please remember that with an external analysis, all you are analyzing is the industry level. You are not yet looking at any firms. When you do an external analysis, either competitive environment or macro environment, you are looking at industry level or population level. Thank you very much for watching.